Reading 35 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 3, Cormier Juglé, June 22, 1946. Work on the Emotional Center. At the London meeting this week, at which all groups were present, the teaching of the work was begun afresh, and one of the main ideas stressed at the beginning was that this system of teaching is based on the idea that man was created specially as an experiment in self-evolution. The work says that man was created a self-developing organism as distinct from the animals. From this point of view, man is incomplete, like a building not yet finished, and it is left to him to finish his own building, to complete himself. For this reason, certain teachings have always existed in the world, which can be called esoteric teachings. For example, this teaching that we are studying is sometimes called esoteric Christianity. This has nothing to do with exoteric Christianity. At this meeting, the three centers of man were touched upon, and it was said that the emotional center in man is in a very bad state. Let us make some brief commentaries on this point that this teaching emphasizes so much. The work says that we must work on our emotional center and purify it, clean it out, get rid of unnecessary emotions that keep us asleep and keep us slaves to external life. Let us take a person who is always cross, always frowning, always bothered, always difficult, in fact, always a nuisance. In such a person, the emotional center is not working aright, and it is necessary for such a person, through long, trained, technical observation, to become aware that this wrong working of the emotional center exists in him or her. Now, a person who is always cross, cantankerous, difficult, quarrelsome, and even venomous has in this work to realize that such a state of the emotional center is quite incompatible with any self-development. That is, this person, whether a man or a woman, has to realize that to complete themselves in the sense of this teaching, to evolve, to develop, is quite impossible as long as the emotional center in him or her remains in this mechanical state. The point is that such persons are quite unaware of the state of the emotional center in themselves. They do not see that they are cross, difficult, fault-finding, unpleasant, angry, and so on. On the contrary, they have a picture of themselves as being very sweet and charming. Therefore, a gap exists in them, a gap in their consciousness of themselves. This gap can only be filled in by sincere and conscious self-observation, carried out according to the instructions given in this teaching for self-observation. People all think they know themselves, but no one does. This is an illusion. Usually, other people know more about ourselves than we do, but they, on the other hand, do not know themselves. So, it is a very good thing to begin to observe the state of your emotional center and the unpleasant manifestations that come from it mechanically. The work teaches that the emotional center is the most wonderful center in us, but that at present, in the state of sleep in which we all exist, it is inundated with negative emotions, with self-pity, with self-emotions, with self-esteem, and 101 other similar forms of emotion that prevent us from really making contact with one another, and so prevent us from understanding one another's difficulties. Work on the intellectual center is different from work on the emotional center, but the work begins with observation of the three main centers in us, And we have to come to the point in which we realize, through self-observation, the state of two centers, what goes on all the time in the intellectual center, and what goes on all the time in the emotional center. Here, you have a man who always dislikes everyone, who jeers at people, who finds fault with people, and so on. Such a man does not know that this is the state of his emotional center. Or a man feels himself always through superiority to other people, but yet does not realize it. The emotional feeling of superiority is always based on self-esteem, on self-love, on self-feeling. In such a case, the emotional center does not work as it should, nor can it fill a person with the right feelings that give him inner meaning and so peace. So it is a good thing to observe the state of one's emotional center, to observe it in action, to observe how it mechanically reacts to external events, and particularly other people. Here lies a great task which is really a life task. This work is for all one's life, and through applying it we gradually undergo a transformation internally, owing to the fact that we become more and more conscious of our real sides and what we really are. This destroys illusions about ourselves. When a man begins really to work on himself, when he has begun to see the depth of this teaching, he can no longer remain the same kind of man. A woman cannot remain the same kind of woman. He or she then begins to understand what it means that people are born on this earth as self-developing organisms, and that there is a special task for everyone that has to be followed and worked out in order to attain this completion, this final development that is their real meaning for being on this very imperfect planet. Each one's task is different, but once the work is understood in its broad outlines, and once the truth of it is acknowledged internally, each one is shown what it is necessary to work at. You must remember that the work teaches that negative emotions are unnecessary, that they complicate life continually, that they produce all the unhappiness that exists in people's relationships to one another, and that it also teaches that it is possible, gradually, to free oneself from these unnecessary negative emotions. Once a person knows this and understands it and sees this inner truth, he has already in his mind a secret of incalculable value. He need never be at a loss, whatever his circumstances, for he will always know what he has to do in any situation. That is, not to express negative emotions, and then to separate from them, and finally, not to have them at all. This work does not teach that we have no right to have negative emotions, because that would be too difficult. It teaches that we have a right not to have negative emotions. All our troubles, domestic tragedies, and so on, are mainly due to nourishing negative emotions, to feeling that we are owed something. I ask you, what do you think you are owed? Examine it, and then look at yourself. When you see what you are like, can you really think you are owed anything? I would say, no. I realize that. On the contrary, I owe to others. A phrase in the Lord's Prayer says, cancel what we owe to God, as we cancel what we think others owe us. That is, as long as your life is based on imagining that others owe to you, you will get nowhere. But as more and more you see that no one owes you anything, and that it is always your own fault, then your accounts, spiritually, are canceled. This gives the possibility of hearing higher centers and what they will tell you. But if you are a mass of internal considering, of self-pity, of feeling you have never had a chance, of feeling that your typical life situation is exceptional, and that no one understands your peculiar difficulties, then you will continue to inundate the emotional center with negative emotions. In that case, it cannot perform its true functions, and so cannot give you inner meaning and peace.